I'm very pleased to welcome our second speaker today. Kresimir Vukovic is a researcher at the New Institute Center for Environmental Humanities, the University of Venice, Ca' Foscari. He obtained a doctorate in classics at the University of Oxford and was a Rome Fellow of the British School at Rome and Alexander von Humboldt Fellow at LMU Munich. He's currently writing a book about conceptions of rivers in the ancient world titled The Living Streams, Rivers as More Than Human Entities in the Ancient World for the series Cambridge Elements and Environmental Humanities. He's recently published a book, just come out this year, called Wolves of Rome, the Lupercalia from Roman and Comparative Perspectives, which is at the top of my list when I get a break from teaching this semester. I'm really keen to take a look. And this deals with the role of non-human animals in Rome's most enduring festival. It's a great pleasure to welcome Kresho.
Thank you for that really kind introduction. And I want to thank you and Jason once again for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here. So as you heard, I've been working on the River Tiber for quite some time. Obviously, the first thing we need to say when we're talking about floods of the Tiber is the fact that you come to Rome now and you don't see what the ancients would have seen, and that is flooding on the basis of a pretty regular basis, really. And that's because of these high embankments. So even when the Tiber levels are really high, such as they have been in the last few decades, it kind of reaches this level of the bridge. And you can see it most clearly here in this picture of the Tiber Island, where the river is almost overflowing. But because the modern embankments are so high, it doesn't really happen. Of course, in ancient Rome, they didn't have this. So they had flooding. This is from Gregory Aldrich's book on the floods of the Tiber, and he estimates that during a minor flood, which is about 10 meters above sea level, which is only a few meters above the normal Tiber level, which is about 6 to 7 meters, you would have substantial areas of the city covered, and so you'd have lots of the campus marshes, the Tiber Island, and the Forum Boarium. And this would happen, according to Aldrich, every 4 to 5 years. And then about once every 2 decades, or between 15 to 20 years, you would have a major flood that would flood the whole of the campus marshes, the Tiber Island, what we call Trastevere now, and pretty much everything between the hills, the Aventine, the Capitoline, and the Palatine, including all the way up to the Forum. So this was something that they had to deal with on a fairly regular basis. And Christopher Schliefacker, whom we also heard about in our previous talk, has recently run a research network funded by the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft that I was a part of. And we looked at the issue of resilience in particular. How does resilience work in the ancient world? And I was working on the issue of Tiber flooding in relation to resilience. And so the theory of resilience basically says that you have to find coping strategies. And these, on the one hand, involved practical steps, such as the one that you can see on your handout, text number 1. So the procuratores and the praetors, so the procuratores in the age of imperial period, obviously, but praetors earlier on, would be in charge of removing trees, dredging, and setting up stone markers for the maximum area of the expansion of the river. So it's actually interesting, the first mention of trees we have in relation to flooding, which is dated to the 2nd century BC, comes from this text, which is later, but can be dated as a citation to the Republican period, where they call about this kind of process whereby you would need to remove the trees that were blocking or obstructing the navigation in the river. But the main topic I'll be talking about is more in the direction of narrativization. So the theory of resilience postulates that normalization and narrativization are crucial strategies or coping mechanisms. So that it's not just what's happening, it's how you address it, how you assign it meaning, and which narratives are being produced in response to flooding. This, of course, as pretty much everything else going on in ancient Rome, has to do with politics and power. So most of the narratives we have, unsurprisingly, are elite narratives. They're not narratives from the lower classes, because most of our sources are, of course, elite sources. It's important to say that from the foundation of Rome down to the imperial period, the river is an agent. The agent in the eco-material sense that we also heard about in our excellent paper just now, previously, that agency is relationality. It's a relation between the non-human, in this case the river, and the human, and it's creating a real impact in the world out there. And the way this agency is narrativized is very closely linked to political dynamics. So most famously in the foundation myth, which we all know, the she-wolf and the twins, the Tiber is cast as a savior of the twins, and this is often overlooked. People don't talk about it as much as they talk about the she-wolf. The flood of the Tiber provides a kind of protection for the basket carrying the infants down to the she-wolf, which is text 2 on your handout. But at the same time, there is a tree, and this is another thing that's often overlooked. The fact that the Ficus Rominalis, or the so-called fig tree Romulus, marks the spot. It's a kind of a cult related to the Lupercal. So it's right next to the Lupercal, the place of the she-wolf and the savage god Faunus. And it sort of acts as a reminder of the twin salvation. And there is a kind of later speculation in late antiquity that this actually, the Ficus Rubinalis, which is obviously not related to Romulus directly, has to do with an old appellation for the Tiber, Rumon. And I'm perfectly aware that Servius is a late source and that lots of his etymologies are made up and kind of respond secondary elaborations on various things in Virgil. But I think that there is something going on here with the notion of rumination. So we have this kind of word rumis, which also is supposed to be interpreted as breast. And all of this is tying up in a series of analogies to the notion of fertility. So I talk about this a lot in my book that's just come out. I think the society of early Rome was one of analogies. It was one where various layers of the cosmos were connected through analogies. And I think the analogies operating here is the fertility of the she-wolf herself, tied to the fertility of the fig tree, tied to the fertility of the Tiber. So all of these are on different levels connected through the analogy of fertility. And if you look at one of the most famous representations in iconography of the foundation myth, you see this quite clearly that there is the she-wolf in the foreground, but also the god Tiberinus on the right, who is reclining and sort of reclining on a jug, which obviously symbolizes his fluvial element, and then holding a reed in his right hand. And then you got the shepherds, Faustulus and his companion in the background. They're reclining at this miraculous site. They're sort of standing back at this miraculous site. But what you have is a variety of animal species. So you have everything from a mouse and a snail to a snake and goat. If you look really carefully in this sort of mid-layer of the picture between the shepherds and the wolf and the Tiber. So the notion that the river is an agent that is creating all of this life. And if you look even more carefully, you'll see that the reed he is holding is actually reproduced in the various reeds that are growing sort of in the space between the feet of the shepherd. So it's a kind of notion of proliferation of fertility that's going on here. And I think that's it's a very important analogy and element in the whole story from the beginning, from the foundation of it. There's of course the other story, the creation of the Tiber Island, which Andrea Brock here has written on recently as well. And this is tied again to politics. So the expulsion of King Tarquin, the major change of constitution, if you will, from monarchy to republic, is accompanied by a change in the Tiber landscape, where the creation of the island from the grain that was left over after the king was expelled from his property, and they cast it into the river, and there is now a new island. So again, this agency of the river is closely tied to changes in the political landscape. And then moving on to talk about more about the foundation myth, so returning to that. We have this curious scene on the Arakazali, which is one of the few iconographic representations from Rome itself. The scene of the rape of Ilia there is also accompanied by a tree. So on the one hand, Mars is coming and the priest is under the shade of a tree. And I'm not going to go in speculation as to which tree it is. But I think it's also important that in that feature of the foundation myth, we already have trees. Ennius, obviously the earliest source, situates the scene of Ilia's rape in a grove or going through a grove of willow trees. So again, there is this notion that the river is sustaining quite a huge ecosystem that involves trees. But Ennius also says something that's really interesting for the rest of the analysis when he points out fortune will stand rise from the river. So Father Aeneas, this is text 4 on the handout, appears to Ilia in a dream, and he says, "You have much to suffer, my child. You will go through lots of problems, but fortune will stand from the river." And this is the verb itself that's used. Resistet is quite curious, and a number of commentators, including Scutch, have said that this is quite unusual, that he's using this verb, because you wouldn't expect this verb to mean rise. It actually means to stand back. And this, I think, ties into a whole range of religious phenomena. So the Temple of Fortune that, as Andrea Brock has recently also pointed out in her article, is very early, in the very early period, connected to the Tiber. And of course, fortune is ambivalent. It changes all the time, just like the river. And then but then when you have all of this ambivalence, how do you approach it? How do you address the issue of flooding if it produces all of these sort of different myths and meanings? And for that, the sort of key piece of evidence that people turn to is, of course, Augustus. Augustus's name is a religious term. It comes from Augusto Augurio, the notion of augury, the notion of positive augury or positive outcome of augury. And itself is derived from the verb augere. And I find the verb augere is really crucial to this conception, or rather conceptions of the floods of the Tiber from early on. Cicero, in a series of letters to Atticus, complains about the expansion of the city, the urbe augenda, which is planned by Caesar. And what he really means when he explains, and then this is text 5, and there are a couple of letters there. But what he really means by Caesar's plans, among other things, is this the diversion of the river Tiber. So Caesar was planning to enlarge the city by creating more space around the campus marshes, diverting the Tiber around the Vatican Hill. And obviously this didn't come to fruition for many reasons, not least the assassination of Caesar. But Cicero says Caesar enlarges the city, which he had never seen 2 years ago, and regards it as too small, though it could hold even himself. And this is a kind of joke on his part, but I think he comes as close as possible to saying this is hubris. The notion that you can change the whole course of the river, and Caesar appears here as a kind of caricature of a giant. And of course, giants or titans, they are the epitome of hubris. And so for Augustus, there comes this challenge of how he's going to respond to this tradition. And I think here we also need to look at text 6, which is Pliny, which is really interesting in his description of the Tiber, most of which is geographical and physical. So it's the natural features that we can all pretty much agree on. He ends this by saying that the Tiber, by his rising auctu, which is again from Augere, admonishes the Romans and calls for religious observance. So it's more religious, his rising, than any other sort of natural propensity of the river. This is quite interesting. So the Tiber is a prophet, a vates, which implies not just a kind of a religious figure, but also agency that is calling to something. So the interpretations abound, but there's a kind of agreement that the flooding itself is a divine sign. It's an omen. And of course, when we're talking about Augere, the Indo-European root of Augere, eug, to increase, is related to a number of words that have to do with might or strength. So the Sanskrit, it's related to Sanskrit ojas. And of course, the augurs were said to increase or create this kind of area for augury, which is an area where you read the signs through divine power. So all of this has to do with power. It's a power play from the beginning. And Augustus is facing this challenge himself, interestingly, on the very night when he assumes his presumptuous new title. So in 27 BC, in January, this is almost 4 years after the Battle of Actium, and he settles on a new name, and he was pondering the name Romulus, and he decided for Augustus. And Horace describes this catastrophic flood, which some people are saying Horace is describing the flood at the death of Caesar. I don't think that's plausible at all, because among other things, you have a whole list of prodigies at the death of Caesar, in Cassius Dio, in Suetonius, and various other authors. None of them mention flooding. And the Odes were actually published around this time, so it's much more likely that Horace is referring to this flood, of 27 BC, that threatened the very center of Rome, including the Temple of Vesta. So the very sanctuary at the heart of the city, representing through its flame the eternity of Rome itself. And he attributes the cause of the flood to the rage of the Tiber, insulted because his wife was abandoned. And this is also a fascinating take, because not many writers in antiquity do so much with this trope, that Elia, who gave birth to the twins, later married the Tiber, or drowned in the Tiber. And so he creates this image of a river that he calls Uxorius, who, as a kind of faithful spouse, wants to avenge his wife, who was, of course, a Vestal virgin. So we can talk about that mythology at length. I talk about it in my forthcoming piece that's in the bibliography. But the really important thing here is the augurs have to respond. So the augurs have to interpret this flood, which is an omen, and they say that just as the Tiber has risen over Rome, so Augustus will rise over the world. Which is, it's quite a spin. They were quite the spin doctors, right? So you have this flooding, you have this huge problem, people are dying, and it's happening exactly on the night when he is choosing his new title, and you say, oh, this is a really good sign. He's going to rise above the world. But it's all coming from this notion of auctor or augere. And of course, so I'm going through various topics that need to be connected. Of course, this is also connected to trees, because when you describe these trees, especially used in construction, we have instances of this in Vitruvius and Pliny. The trees, in fact, they are augent, they rise. And the way Pliny describes the trees that are used in construction, the highest trees, they're rising to the highest possible levels. So there is a common sort of language or analogies between the highest trees used in construction, the language of empire, and the flooding, the rises of the Tiber. And all of this is connected, of course, to power and empire. So one of the most frequent formulas that the emperors use to express their success is augent. They have augent pomerium. So augent, the singular. He increased the pomerium. He increases the pomerium. And pomerium, of course, is the sacred religious boundary of the city, directly tied to the boundaries of the empire. Okay, so looking at the instances of flooding more closely, you can see this is a list from Aldred. Unsurprisingly, there is a very dense cluster of frequent Tiber flooding in the period 60 BC to 15 CE. And whenever I teach environmental history, I ask my students why, because this is this is very, very much the kind of thing where you can see how much they know about the sources. Obviously, most of our sources come from this period. So we can't really say, oh, this really was the period of highest density, because the other periods are just not as attested. But there we are. These are the attested instances. Now, the construction projects that happen at the same time, first starting with Pompey, building his stone theater on the Campus Martius, and continue with Agrippa and Augustus building the most famous monuments on the Campus Martius. So the Pantheon and the Horologium and Augustus's mausoleum. So all of these were celebrated as a kind of triumph over the Tiber, because the Campus Martius, if you remember from that image of flooding at the beginning, this is getting flooded most of all. Even a small flood will flood most of the Campus Martius. So basically, it's a floodplain. And the fact that you can now build things there, that you can claim it as a part of the city, means that you have some power over the river. And so this language of power is also becoming is becoming a language of power over the river more specifically. And this is, of course, despite the irony that in less than a decade, all of this is flooded by the Tiber and the horologium is off, because it depends on a very precise alignment of the sundial, the obelisk sundial with the particular inscriptions of the horologium that are on the ground that are supposed to, that the sun is supposed to cast a shade on in certain times of year. And so the language of elite narrativization of power of the Tiber is happening despite the fact that the agency of the river is coming to reclaim this area. And deforestation is happening all the while. So deforestation in the Tiber Valley in the Augustan period and the late Republic is obviously inevitable because of the construction projects. And if you look at the text 8 on your handout, Strabo very clearly says that a lot of the timber for the construction project is being floated down the Tiber because that's the easiest way. You cut the trees, you send them down to the river, and you float them down to Rome. And when I was speaking about this last year at the conference in Switzerland, I was confronted by a senior scholar who shall remain unnamed. And he tried to challenge this by saying that among various things, the pollen samples from the mid-Tiber Valley do not give conclusive evidence of trees in this period being cut down more than they were in other periods of the Republic and the Empire. However, if you look at this Mensing et al. Article from 2018, these are pollen samples from a lake that's actually 50 kilometers away from the Tiber. It is close to one of the tributaries, the Nile River tributary, but I don't think it's a huge piece of evidence for anything, because on the one hand, it's quite far from the Tiber. On the other hand, it doesn't give conclusive evidence for deforestation or any of this kind of thing either way. I think Harris, William Harris, who was very much a hyper-skeptic when it came to deforestation in the ancient world, and this is obviously a huge topic that we can talk about at length, even he was willing to admit in his paper of 2013 that the Tiber Valley case is definitely a substantial case of deforestation because of all these sources that are clearly saying this is happening. And then in the later imperial period, we have other sources saying that now for timber, the Romans are looking to areas such as Histria and Rhaetica and Corsica. And if you have to go to Istria, so to Croatia to get your timber, that very likely means that you're not getting it from the usual sources in Italy anymore. However, the proxy data that's now emerging from speleothems in North Italy complicate the picture a bit more because they indicate increased precipitation in the Augustan period. And if you're saying, well, North Italy is not the Tiber, well, yes, but the way that the weather works, and this you know if you happen to live in North Italy like I do at the moment, is you have the Genoese cyclones. So basically the cyclones are formed in the Bay of Genoa and they slowly descend down the Apennine Peninsula. So most of the precipitation that would have happened in North Italy would have been matched by the situation in the Tiber Valley. So this definitely complicates the picture, and any sort of single factor interpretation that we might advance. But I think still the deforestation going on is important. Now, if you look at this construction on the campus marshes, so the buildings in the red are the new buildings that are being constructed in the Augustan period. And the little sort of aqua or cyan there in the middle, the Stagnum Agrippa, is this pool that Agrippa built next to his baths. And the Aqua Virgo that was supplying the pool, which is obviously this major aqueduct that he brings to Rome, is feeding the pool and the baths. But then you have the Euripus. So you have this channel that's going from the pool down, or rather north up, and then all the way up to the Tiber. And there's a debate in the scholarship as to what this channel is actually doing. What I think it's doing is it's obviously a drain for the backwater that's produced by the baths on the one hand. But on the other hand, if you look at this term Euripus, what it signifies usually in antiquity is places where water flows one way at one time and then the other way. So I think what's going on here is at certain points, especially during Tiber flooding, the channel was supposed to relieve the water left over after the floods. And in this sense, it was a bit like the Cloaca Maxima in the early period. So the drainage of water that's left after the flooding is an issue that the ancients were aware of. But then, when it comes to trees in the campus marshes, and this is something that Andrew Fox here has written in his recent book, we have lots of trees being planted alongside all of these major constructions, such as the Stone Theatre of Pompey, the Mausoleum of Augustus, and so on. And they have a variety of purposes, as Andrew has well described in his book. And I think one of the potential purposes that usually is not considered is also in relation to flooding. So when you have a floodplain, if you plant trees on it, you are much more likely to absorb the water. Trees absorb lots of the water that otherwise would have stayed and caused a whole bunch of problems, not just for construction, but also in terms of diseases, because stagnant water is a huge source of disease. So in this reconstruction, we can see a bit of that, but probably there were even more trees on the campus marshes in the Augustan period. So to conclude, I want to look at the issue of who's in control, because we have all these issues. We have deforestation. We have, on the one hand, the planting of trees, which seems kind of paradoxical, right? So on the one hand, you're planting trees here. On the other hand, you're cutting trees there. But the more I look into this issue, the more I see that there's a whole range of contradictions going on. So major floods continued to the end of the Principate, and Augustus was already on the verge of doing something about this when he died. And of course, the initiative was taken over by Tiberius. He appoints a committee to look into the issue, and this is text number 10, which is quite long, so I'm not going to obviously read out the whole thing. But the conclusion that the committee reached is the best thing to do would be to divert some of the Tiber tributaries and make them flow into the Arno, which is the other major river in central Italy. Of course, all the local communities that lived there were up in arms about this. They went to petition the Senate and say, no, we really don't want this to happen because, well, for obvious reasons, we would lose all of our livelihood. And in the Senate, there is a debate. And there's quite an interesting way, there's quite an interesting sentence, the way Tacitus describes this. In relation between Tiberius himself and the Tiber. And there was a recent article by Patrick Kragelund in the CQ about this, where he points out that one of the arguments put forward was to say the Tiber does not wish to flow with his glory diminished, which is quite a curious way to put it. On the one hand, it's recognizing the religious role, which is also a part of that argument, that the Tiber is sacred. You can't just decide to diminish something that is so crucial to the fate of Rome. On the other hand, the issue of glory in the Annals, especially in this book of the Annals, is related to the glory of Tiberius. This is the most frequent way that the glory appears here. And of course, Tiberius is a name derived from Tiberius. So again, Tiberius is picking up on Caesar and picking up on Augustus and using the Tiber to talk about himself. His glory does not wish to be diminished. And then the Tiber is a kind of reflection of the new prince's glory, which needs to be upheld in this critical situation when he's just coming to power. Okay. So the political aspect is again crucial here, and Tiberius follows up on this committee by appointing a permanent senatorial committee of 5 men to oversee the river, and they're called the Curatores Riparum et Alvae Tiberis. And one of the things they do is they go around putting these stone markers, and they have dozens of inscriptions that survive. And there's a debate about what is this for, because they're never on the shore of the banks of the Tiber as we see them now. They are farther away, and clearly they're related to flooding. So when the river floods, what you want is to allow it as much space as possible and not to have buildings in its way so that the river can actually expand and also that people's property isn't destroyed. So this is a kind of way to say, okay, we're going to accept the fact that the Tiber is flooding, but again, we're going to use this as an excellent opportunity to advertise who's in control, because these are powerful senators, these are elite men, and the fact that they're going around setting up these inscriptions claiming to somehow help with the flooding, which is continuing nevertheless, is again propaganda for their own political gain. So on the one hand, the river is doing all that it's been doing from the beginning. The flooding continues. It's acknowledged that the Tiber is a god. The agency of the Tiber is explicitly acknowledged in this text of Tacitus. But the spin that the elites are trying to create is we are actually in control. And alongside the examples that I've already discussed, we of course have Portus. So Portus, the major new imperial harbor of Rome, that was started under Claudian. So the first basin was built by Claudian, and later Trajan built this other huge new basin. So it was very much a project for the generations. And there is a Claudian, so there's an inscription from the Claudian period at the construction of porches, advertising this as a major project and achievement, but also at the same time saying it was made to liberate Rome from the danger of flooding. And this kind of notion that they're creating a new outlet by cutting the Tiber before Ostia, a few kilometers before Ostia, and then diverting this part of the Tiber down to Portus, and that this is somehow a relief for floods in Rome, which obviously, again, doesn't work. So there's this constant back and forth between the river and what the river is doing and the political spin that is being created in the form of these narratives. Thank you.